let's talk lighting. I did do a video on this a while back, how just some of the basics of lighting in Adobe After Effects. This time, let's talk about kind of more principle focus on how you can use lighting to make your shows really pop and to make them even better. And so these are principles that you can use in any software, Adobe, Luxedo, DaVinci. They really apply even in physical props, like if you have your own haunt or Christmas display, then some of these things still matter too. So this is kind of a principle focused and some tips and tricks on how we can use lighting to make our shows look better. And I am no master in visual arts, but I do watch the masters. I look at what Disney does in particular at their parks or in their cartoons, and there's a lot we can learn from them. And so we're going to look at some clips from this Disney short from the 50s. It's one we did a projection show on. It's a fun little Halloween one. And even back then, the principles I'm going to talk about are going to be all used here too. So they get it. So 10 lighting tips to improve your projection mapping shows. So tip number one is to think of it as augmented reality rather than just thinking of it as a projection screen. The projection screen is just typically flat. Augmented reality, you're trying to make it appear as if it's the object itself. And so that's really what we're shooting for with some of these facades that we did, is to make it look like the house is made of wood and is dilapidated. So think of it as augmented reality rather than just a projection screen. And so that's going to kind of guide these other principles, because what you're really trying to do with the lighting is replicate real life, or maybe it's sometimes surreal life, but you want it to look like it's the object itself, not just a projection show. So that's number one. Think augmented reality, not projection screen. Tip number two is to cheat a little with lighting by finding textures that give the illusion of good lighting. So it's a little detail, but you see kind of throughout this cartoon how much attention they pay to textures, like even the wood grain on this wood panel just on the title sequence, which we aren't paying too much attention to, but they take the time to do it. Let's look at a couple of other examples. They've got the rug here, has texture to it. Wood in the background there in the scene. Got the bricks. Like this wall here is pretty plain, but they still have it kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, but dappled or broken up to break up the texture. And that can give the illusion of good lighting. And so an example recently from one of our shows, in the Stranger Things, we used this trim for the Krill house, and it ended up working really good, even in person. This is just virtual, it's just projected, but in person it looks real. It looks 3D. It looks like this is actually the house. And that was without doing anything fancy with After Effects, is just finding a good texture. So that's tip number two, is cheat and see if you can find a texture that will make it look like you have good lighting, shadows, and realism. Then tip number three is shadows. And I've also talked about that in this other video on lighting and shadows. So I won't go into it too much, but what we're shooting for is wherever a light source would be, that we're mirroring that in our projections. So you look at this scene with the clock, and it's just a cartoon. No kid's going to notice if there's a shadow back there, but that background ambiance is what helps give it realism and helps give it the feels. So even in this one, it's got little shadows from the clock. And we could probably find just a bunch of random examples as we go through this. They're using shadows on the different surfaces of the walls, as well as the objects. Big shadow there from her. I think there's some more examples when they're in the house that we could use. Let's see. Yeah, mostly in the background they're doing it. They've got all these different shadows. So I don't need to belabor the point, but Shadows will help give it depth, make it look real, make it look 3D. And what you'll want to do is just think about where the lighting would be in real life and where it would be shining, and then the natural place that the shadow would be cast. Number 4 that we've already kind of touched on is that using lighting, even just basic lighting, will help break up the uniformity of something to make it look better. So you look at the wallpaper in the back, they didn't leave it as just flat. Or even this uniform color here, they didn't leave it a flat lighting. They break it up with lighting and shadows. So here you've got a light source, you've got slightly different light over here, you even have light coming in from the window. So that can give us a clue as to something we can do, right? This wall here has texture and shadows and the lighting to break up the uniformity. And it makes a big difference. You look at this one that I've been playing around with. This is what it looks like before we do any lighting effects. It looks cool. It's got good texture, but it's pretty flat. And then as soon as you add lighting, then it pops. Okay. So that's tip number 4. Use the lighting to help break up the uniformity. Oh, one thing too that I haven't really played with yet, but I need to. I keep reminding myself is with the shadows to play with Dappled Light. I think I saw that on Van Oak's channel where you can have a tree, shadow of tree, and how it has the light shining through, but it's broken up into the different pieces, different shadows from the leaves. And I think that would look really cool to have the light even broken up into little small segments, to Dappled Light. Okay. Number 5, we're trying to make it, touched on this too, but we're trying to make the lights look as they would in real life. So wherever the light source would be, like in this case, we got the fire and the cauldron, then that's the source of the light. So we're going to move our virtual light in After Effects or wherever tool we're using and point it in that direction. Now, one of the things that you can tell if you've done this right is if we shined a light just straight onto the surface, then it's going to be a perfect circle and it might have a crisp edge. But you'll notice that it's not a straight circle, it's more conical. A light beam has a cone to it. And so it's going to be oblong, it's going to be shaped a little bit different. It's going to be smaller at the bottom and bigger at the top because the light source is coming from the bottom and pointing upwards. And so that little shift of position helps make it match real life. And so where possible, let's turn on my layers here, to have the light source not necessarily straight on. Sometimes you do, but having it come from the side. Let's turn off a couple of these layers here so we can see what I'm doing. Like that one is pretty straight on, but then these other 2 are coming from an angle, and that mirrors real life and makes it less obvious that you're using fake digital lights. All right, that's tip number 5. Oh, and some other things you can do with that too with real life is then you can add things like a flicker of a fire. So we did that we've done it in a bunch of them, but like in the Pirates of the Caribbean show, when there is fire scenes right here, then we have that flickering effect that makes like you get with real life with a fire. And I really like how it turned out with the scene in the jail too. And the scene we used flickering on the embers and in the different parts of the scene. And we're randomizing it a little bit so that the light in this portion is going at one rate, but the light over here is going at a different rate because that's how it would be with fire. It wouldn't be all the same pattern, same cadence. All right, tip number 6 is to play with colors. And I know this has to do with lighting, but the colors I find to be related. So with your lighting, to not just use the same color of lights, but to use different colored lights to add some variety. And I think I rendered this video out, so it'll play better. Yeah, with this one. So you can see this is an example. I have various different kinds of colors of lights that were shining. As the red moon comes up, then it changes the color of the entire house. It fades to purple. See, I've got purple and red lights all kind of intermixed here. Really good cinematographers that I've seen understand how to use colors really well. Guillermo del Toro, in some of his stuff, he does really good colors. Obviously, Disney does colors on this scene. It's got different colors in the pot, and then as she's adding different things, then the colors on the background change too. Right there. And so when we did our little trick or treat show, we mirrored that exact scene where we changed the colors right in sync with the colors on the background. So play around with colors too. That's tip number 6. 7 is contrast. And contrast is, it's really just trying to make sure that there's a bigger difference between the lights and the darks. My personal opinion is I think that's even more important with projection mapping, because sometimes it's not as obvious. If we're on a screen, these differences are obvious, but blowing up on the house, even at 1080, the pixels are still going to be relatively big. We're still not going to have super great detail. People are often far away from watching from the road. And so exaggerating a little bit the contrast between the lights and the darks is going to make these efforts of lighting more effective. It's going to make it more obvious. So like my shadows, I always bump up my shadows up to 100% darkness so that there's that contrast. And most of my videos, I'll bump up the brightness and the contrast so that it's as obvious as I can get. Subtlety is going to get missed. And so there's some good examples of contrast here in this Disney one still. Like when they're on the porch, you have the light right focused where the animators want us to watch. And then you got the stuff in the background that is contrasted. Nice bright warm colors over here. And then you got the dark blues over here in the background. And then tip number 8 that I just kind of touched on is we can use the lighting to draw attention to where we want people to look. The background lighting in the scene was all important. It was all deliberate. It was part of the ambiance. They added this blue lighting in the back, but they've had the strongest light and the warmest light here in the foreground to draw our attention to it. So that's what I'm endeavoring to do with this. Turned off my light. That one right there was deliberate to draw attention to this portion of the facade, because that's where we're going to put a logo for a haunt that we're doing some work for. So you can use the light to draw attention to where you want people to look. On our Stranger Things one, we had this one scene I was playing with. I mean, so much of this is we're just playing around with stuff to get it looking the way we want, right? Yeah, right here in the tunnel scene, I wanted people to notice that this was a tunnel, and with a static light, it looked a little too flat. It wasn't as easy to tell that it was supposed to be 3D and that it was supposed to be a tunnel. But as soon as I added some movement with the light, then that draws attention to when this guy hops out from around the corner, and that lighting ends up helping it look more 3D, like what I was after. So you can use the lighting to draw attention to where you want. Another good example of that is at this scene of the Baird Manor, we have lighting across the entire facade, but at one point we want to draw attention to the door. And so everything else gets dimmed and the light on the door is the only one. And so naturally people's eyes are just going to be drawn right to that. The other piece of what draws our attention is movement. And so that's the other reason why I had the light movement here. Anytime there's movement, our eyes want to go to it. So tip number 8 is drawing attention. Tip number 9 is layers. And so you'll see this again with Disney too. They'll tend to do lots of layers in their scenes. And generally speaking, it'll be more muted, less detailed in the background. And then as you come forward, then it gets brighter and gets increased detail. They even do this at the parks with forced perspective. With some of these buildings, they'll try to make them look bigger or taller than they actually are. And part of what helps with the forced perspective is having the details less clear up higher and a little more muted. And so, like if I were going to construct this scene in a projection mapping, I'd have one layer that's the black background. I'd have a layer for the stars. I'd have a layer for the clouds. I'd have a layer for this house with the tree. I'd have a layer for mist. I'd have one for the back part of the porch and for the floor. And so it's a lot, but if you can think of it in layers and add details, you come closer and closer and have the lighting more obvious and intense closer you get. That gives depth and gives realism. And I had an example of that. Actually, pretty much all it shows, I try to do that. But even in this one, I got the background, I got the lightning, I got the clouds, I got the trees, and then I've got the facade, and then I've got the lighting. So lots of layers, like an onion, like Shrek. See if there's any other examples in here I wanted to show. Oh, this one was going back to the contrast for a second. This is a good example of contrast. This video I got from High Res Designs, if I remember right. And they're using a mixture of colors and contrast on the right side of this part of the video. The part I got from them is this frame, basically, where the cannons are. So they've got a warm orange light with flickering light right here. And then over here, it's a bluer light. So that makes great color contrast with the flickering fire too. Then after that, the tip number 10 is just to get creative, to think of fun things that you can do with the lighting. Some of it could just be flickers on the lights. So I've got subtle flickering on these lanterns that are on this scene. We have the treasure scene. In here somewhere, I had the light from the gold flickering. Kind of want to make it look a little bit better, but that was the intent, is getting some shimmering here from the gold. Oh yeah, I remember what it was now. In the Krill house, there's some fun lighting in the Krill house scene. When it flickers on this scene, then we have the light flickering along with it. And then at this moment, you kind of watch how, as the house gets switched to the old version, the present day version, you've got some light streaming in from this window. And so I did a little effort to try to make that the same. And when they break the glass is when the light shows up here on the porch, just like it does in the video. And then when the door opens, then that light expands like it would in real life to let more light in. And then at this part, when it's going to the upside down, I'm using a red flashing light mirroring this video. Cool. So hopefully that gives you some ideas. The top 10 things again: think augmented reality, not projection screen. Look for textures to cheat. That will give the illusion of 3D and good lighting. Use shadows to your advantage. Basic lighting is going to be better. It's going to, even just a little bit of lighting is going to make a big difference. As a side note, in our Patreon folder, we'll provide some of those in case you're using something like Luxido and you can't add the lighting. Then we have a flat version, but we also have lighted versions. It's basic lighting. Number 5 was think about what the light would do in real life and try to match that, but have it be through theatrical real life. Have the lights from the side, have cool colors. And so that's tip number 6 too, is having good colors, being creative with the colors, because that's going to help make things pop. Same thing with number 7, contrast. Contrast is going to make it more obvious for people that are looking at it from a distance. And that leads to tip number 8, that with all those things, with the colors and the contrast and matching real light, you can help draw attention to where you want people to focus on for different parts of your show. Tip number 9 was layers, to build your shows in layers with less detailed, more muted in the background. And then as you come in the foreground, it becomes brighter and more clear. And then just have fun. It's a busy time of year, but it's fun with lots of creative ideas going around as we're building our shows for Halloween and Christmas this year. So I hope that was helpful. And I do have the other video out there on how to do this in After Effects. If we want to do kind of a part two of that one and show how did some of the specific lighting effects in these shows, then just let me know.